My name is Lorena O. English, and I'm a social sciences librarian at Social Sciences and Government Documents librarian at the WSU Libraries, which is one building away for all of those present, one website away for all of those who are watching it from our global campus or on YouTube sometime in the future. And what we're going to be doing today is doing our public square debate, and I just wanted to remind everyone kind of what the public square was really all about. And the Public Square Project of the Center for Civic Engagement, also the libraries, is a public discussion initiative aimed to involve the campus and extended community in civil discussion of critical issues, consider issues on a local, regional, national, global levels, and reclaim the tradition and art of public discourse. So we really emphasize the polite nature of engaged argumentation. Today we're going to be talking about free speech, and just to kind of give context from how we've described this, recently in America, free speech has come to the forefront with protests, rallies, and the media. And of course, I'd like to add that this is nothing new. Free speech has been in the forefront pretty much every decade for many years, for many reasons. So this is not something new. It has historical roots, and that might come up during our discussion today. Why is free speech such a divisive but necessary component of our democracy? What does free speech even mean? So you're going to join us here today at our public square to kind of hash some of these ideas out. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists, and I'm not going in order of where they're sitting, I'm going in order of how they're going to speak. So we start off with Dr. Elizabeth Blanks-Heineman, who is an associate professor in the Murrow College of Communications. Our second speaker will be Orion Welsh. Orion is an undergraduate student in political science and criminal justice, and he's also vice president of the student group Black Men Making a Difference. Our third panelist is Josh Monroe, who is a graduate student in politics, philosophy, and public affairs, and he is with the Graduate and Professional Students Association, the GPSA. And our final presenter is Daniel Records Galbraith, and Dan is with the Office of Equal Opportunity. He is the Affirmative Action EEO Coordinator and Senior Investigator for the Washington State University Pullman campus. So I welcome our panelists. And what I'd like to do now is just kind of invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and they're going to have 5 minutes for their opening statements. And they don't have to take all the 5 minutes, but we're going to try to do that. And just so you won't be surprised, we have someone in the front row who's going to be indicating 1 minute left. So if you see her waving her hands or doing anything like that, that is actually part of the program and not something that you need to be concerned about. All right, let's go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Heineman.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all of you for being here. I teach First Amendment law in the College of Communication, and it's always been a delight to do that. It's been more interesting the last year or so because free speech has always mattered, but students really see how it affects them directly, more than maybe they did a generation ago. So I'm going to do two things in this opening statement. I'm first going to talk a little bit about the topic, which is what is the value of free speech. I'm going to give you a little bit of grounding in what legal scholars have said, why we protect free speech, and then I'm going to briefly take us through American history so you can kind of see where we are today and where we've been, all in 5 minutes. There was a legal scholar in the 40s who really put together his idea of what the general reasons are that we protect free speech. The First Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1791, and since then we've had cases and understanding about what it means. And so he gathered the reasons for protecting free speech into 4 general categories, and I hope we'll talk about these. The first is what's called the marketplace of ideas. And the reason we protect speech there, under that concept, is so that all ideas are protected, so that we can move forward as a society, because no idea is too silly or too radical or too strange or too odd or too out there. And if we protect the ability of people to share their ideas, then we all bat those around. And we converse with them, and we talk about them, and we sometimes shoot them down. We debate them, and the idea behind that is at the end of that conversation, maybe we've moved just a little bit more toward truth. And that's how we progress as a society, by having access to all kinds of radical ideas. The second reason that's been given for protecting free speech is related to the first one, but it's more specific. It's the notion of political self-determinism. All of you in this room are over 18, and I'm guessing most of you are citizens. We have the right to vote. We have the right to advocate for public policy. We are the people. We are the governed and the government. And there's no way we can make wise public policy decisions if we don't have access to information. And so, related to the marketplace of ideas, but more specifically about public policy, we can't make good choices as a community, as a country, without the ability to know what those choices are about. So political self-determination. The third, one scholar described as social stability, the idea that if someone's angry, they're more likely to get over, not to get over that anger, but to articulate that anger if they can speak about it. If they're not allowed to speak, not allowed to articulate their frustration, maybe with the government or with society or with somebody else, they may act out in violence. And so if we protect the right of people to petition the government for redress of grievances or to just simply show their frustration, they're less likely to physically be violent. And so in that sense, it protects our society. And I'll also later, I hope anyway, talk about the notion of tolerance and how protecting radical ideas teaches us how to be tolerant of those radical ideas. And the fourth reason that is given for protection of free speech is we are human beings, and we grow and learn to be our own individual selves through communication. And if we aren't able to articulate our beliefs, our ideologies, our core values, then we can't be that. So that's the four reasons. As far as historical context, as I said, the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, and it says, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech. In other words, the government can't stop our speech, but of course the government does stop our speech. Just 7 years later, the Congress passed a law that made it illegal to criticize the opposite party. The party in power said, you can't criticize the other party. Now that seems a little outdated now, but that's what happened first. Throughout the 19th century, we had all kinds of social movements that if you weren't white, male, landowning, literate, you had no speech rights. If you were an abolitionist, you had no speech rights. If you were a woman suffragist or a union organizer, you had no speech rights. In the 20th century, if you were a communist or a socialist, you had no speech rights. It really took the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement, to bring into the fold the concept of protecting speech. So speech is protected, certainly civil rights protesters. It's protected Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious minorities. It's also protected the Ku Klux Klan. It's also protected the American Nazi Party. It protects the radical right to speak. I'll stop there.
On that note, the value of free speech to me is important, but the term freedom does not apply to everybody in America. And I speak from a minority point of view, and I can only speak from my personal point of view, is that we can say what we want, but many times it's doctored or it's cut off to the point where what we say is not really what's being heard. And there's always consequences to what we speak as freedom of speech. And going back to the civil rights movement, many individuals did lose their lives, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, so on and so forth, lost their lives because they chose to speak out against the government, a very popular party at that. And even to this day, many people of color, not only black, but many different minorities in this country, both undocumented and documented citizens and not, don't have that true freedom to speak. I was involved in the sit-in on campus as well as many marches on campus, and in my opinion, the reason that we have to march is because although we are free to speak, we are not heard. And unless we have to push a certain initiative, we are still not heard. And so we have to continue to yell a little bit louder and walk a little bit further because we're not given that equal freedom that everybody else is given. And to me, the value of freedom of speech is it's a great concept, but again, it's not for everybody. And you look at, the term hate speech comes up. Now, hate speech is not defined, it's defined by Wikipedia as something that is discriminatory against a religion, sexual orientation, ethnic-based, and disability-based. I'm not sure if I'm missing anything after that. But many say that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment, freedom of speech. I don't necessarily agree with that statement. I feel like it should be something that needs to be separated. Although it's not a term that has been defined or is, is something that is set in stone, it is something that is real. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term fighting words, but fighting words and hate speech, in my opinion, go hand in hand. And if you incite violence by any means necessary, then there should be repercussions to that. However, the term freedom of speech always comes into play, and they seem to try and protect that. Thinking of the KKK and the Nazi Party, their words always seem to be protected. However, when you look at the Black Panther Party and things that speak out against, or not against, but for, Black minorities, there always seems to be some kind of censorship, some kind of repercussion against us, and we're labeled as terrorists or somebody who's trying to incite violence. So.
Hi all. Real quick question. Is anybody here a graduate or professional student here at WSU? Got one? Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad that I've got at least one constituent that is here. So I'll just speak really quickly on my personal experience as someone who's been studying political science for the last 5+ years, and then I'll conclude with kind of the position of the Graduate and Professional Student Association on this issue of free speech on campus and recent hate actions and hate speech that has kind of plagued the academic community here. So since I'm a student of American politics, I focus on policy communications and how social identity influences how policy is often marketed to individuals and to groups. And social identity is a theory that's been floating around for decades now. And it kind of is based on works of psychologists that people want to hold a good self-conception. And the best way that they do that is by forming groups, joining groups. Oftentimes, if you grew up, you were probably part of the 4-H group or the American business leaders, or young American business leaders. You were parts of groups from childhood up to adulthood, and you form positive conceptions of those groups. And you also measure those against groups that you don't associate with, and you often take on negative views. How this relates to the issue of free speech is that when unpopular opinions, regardless of where they come up, there's always going to be a backlash of sort. And it's a responsibility of the government, of the society, of our communities around us to be able to provide a safe and secure environment for everybody to coexist. Even if you don't agree, we want to make sure that nobody feels like that their safety and their rights are being silently or vocally denied to them. So as a member of the Graduate and Professional Student Association, I am the Vice President of Legislative Affairs, which means I'm essentially the head lobbyist. So I go to DC and Olympia, multiple times a year to go advocate on behalf of graduate and professional students. But part of that is also recognizing where salient political issues come up. And the last 12 months, last 14 months, has really shown that the issue of campus climate, free speech are things that can't be overlooked. So a couple of months ago, our organization drafted a resolution that stated that the Graduate and Professional Student Association is taking a formal stand against any actions or expressions of hate speech, hate action. We oppose the presence of people that have been promoting such messages in recent months, but we understand at the same time that we don't have a legal stand to really push for change because of the technical constraints of the First Amendment. This is where the normative and the empirical, so the normative of what we would like to see done and the empirical of what the technical limitations are, this is where they come in conflict. But from where we stand, we understand that this issue is one that affects graduate and professional students just as much as undergraduate students. We're all concerned, just as well as faculty and administration are concerned about this issue as well. So that's just kind of a formal statement that from every level, I hope that we can have a formative and substantive continued debate on this issue for the continued improvement of our academic environment here at WSU.
So as we were going through these, the rest of the panelist statements, I'm marking off because I think Beth took a lot of my words. And some of the things that Orion said are things that I think are very important for this discussion as well. I kind of want to draw a distinction, when I was thinking about the question, what is the value of free speech? I think there's a couple of different aspects that we need to look at and separate out a little bit. And one is the idea that, there is value in protecting speech generally. And I think, there's a difference between protecting speech as a concept and saying that a particular form of expression has value of its own right. Because there are lots of things that people say that I don't think are particularly valuable to society. And so there's a difference between when the government says that we have to allow this, between the government saying we think this is okay for this person to say, versus this is something that we're not going to prevent them from saying. So there's a distinction there that I think we should keep in mind. And the reason why we make that distinction, why the legal community, why our legal history makes that distinction, is for a lot of the reasons that Beth talked about, those 4 reasons. And at an institution of higher education, one of the reasons at the top of that list is that marketplace of ideas, where this is an environment where we are encouraged to come together to discuss ideas and concepts that are pertinent to life outside the university, pertinent to our government, to our society, to our culture. And we should be able to discuss those in a way where people can bring to the table a variety of different viewpoints and discuss those openly. But the reality is that there are some forms of expression that do harm others beyond what the legal protections against instigating violence, encouraging violence, inciting violence, or actually carrying out violence. Words do hurt, and they have all sorts of impacts on individuals, on groups, that it's not something that's easy for the government to try to regulate and determine what those harms are. There's a lot of instances where there are, when somebody is using words in a way that invalidates or cuts to the core of someone's identity, to their core values and beliefs, or to their identity of self, because of immutable characteristics or other characteristics, like some of the things that Orion mentioned that the law says are protected class categories. So race, religion, sexual orientation, the whole list. Those things, when people talk about those things in a way that is negative towards those groups, those group members don't necessarily view the distinction between somebody threatening me, threatening violent action against me, versus somebody is invalidating my existence as a human being. There's a lot of disrespect and indignity in allowing those expressions to occur. And this is a problem that our society has grappled with for the entire existence of our country. And the world has grappled with this problem for longer than that. When you think back to the history of why the founders put in the Constitution this protection against government restriction on free speech, it's easy to kind of conjure up an image of somebody criticizing the king and then the king lashing out against them and punishing them, putting them in jail, or executing them for that criticism. And that's a big part of why the government shouldn't be allowed to restrict people's speech, because we are a government that is governed by the people, and the people are the ultimate arbiters of what is and is not protected speech. In order for the legal, kind of the judiciary to make changes in that area, changes to the Constitution, it would take a shift in the viewpoint of the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. And so all of these government actors that fall underneath the Constitution, so state governments, the federal government, cities and municipalities, and government actors like the university, we're constrained by those principles that are set forth in the Constitution and how the Supreme Court interprets that. So there are a lot of things that I as an individual might want to step in and intervene on, but I'm constrained by those principles. And so as a people and as a society, we need to continue having these discussions to carve out the edges of where those boundaries are, and see if there are things that we as a people think are crossing a line that should not be crossed.
All right, what we're going to do now is this is a chance for people to ask questions, and we'll do this for a while, and then at the end, we're going to give our panelists all a chance to have kind of some wrap-up conversation. And I want to remind everyone that this is something that's not just taking place here and now. We may get some questions coming from our global campus students, so be prepared for Ben over there in the corner to perhaps wave his hand and say, I've got a question from someone. So let's go ahead and get started. Does anyone have a question? And because this is being recorded, what I'm going to ask you to do is just come up to the front and hold the mic so that, so that for the benefit of people who can't be with us today, they'll be able to see what's going on in an easier fashion. So do we have anyone who'd like to start? I feel like Oprah. You get a car and you get a car. You get free speech, but you don't. All right, come on over.
So I guess to Mr. Record, so you talked about your opening, this way. How does your opening statement apply to your place in the Office of Equal Opportunity here? How does that play out?
I'm participating in this event as an individual. I have experiences from my time as an administrator here at WSU, but my views don't necessarily represent the views of the university. This is something that I think people in positions like mine that are asked to review complaints. I think a lot of people in these positions struggle with these types of questions of, we have a bunch of needs that we're trying to figure out how to navigate. We want to protect the safety and the concerns of our students, but we also are constrained by these limitations in federal law and the Constitution, and also our state constitution has restrictions there as well. So it's, when you're operating within that kind of environment, there's a lot of tough calls that people have to make, and it can be difficult because it's not always something that you necessarily agree with on a kind of personal or substantive level. But in the position that I have to operate within an environment where I make decisions from a neutral perspective. And so I can't let my personal feelings influence my decisions in that respect, because I'm not, the Constitution doesn't give me that authority to act beyond that. So does that answer your question? Or is there something else?
I guess I'm thinking of like an example was last semester when there was flyers that went out asking people to report like students who were like undocumented or that kind of thing. Would that be something that is sort of across that line of like hate speech versus like free speech, like putting out flyers is something that people can do, but putting out flyers threatening other people?
And let's extend this to
Yeah, too.
Sure. I'll just say that, I'm not actually able to answer questions on specific incidents, especially incidents that happen at WSU that I may have been involved in because of the nature of my work. But if I may, I might re-articulate that in a little broader sense. There have been instances across the country of flyers being posted on college campuses that are kind of attacking or denigrating or calling to action people to take action against people who they believe may be undocumented immigrants, or may be gay or lesbian or transsexual, transgendered, or any other protected class. We've seen that recently, but there's a long history of that happening in our country. And one of the first things that a university would have to do there is make an assessment of, do we know who's doing this? Because when flyers come up, we don't necessarily know the individuals that are doing that. We don't have cameras all over campus. We're not monitoring students' activity 24/7. So when a flyer shows up, it's typically when somebody finds it and they report it to the university. And there's oftentimes in those situations, we're very limited on kind of being able to investigate because there's just no evidence of who did it. And so that's a limitation, in that warrants a response from the university, but we're not going to be able to hold an individual accountable if we don't know who they are. The other thing is that sometimes, it's such a fact-specific analysis of, within the constraints of some of the Supreme Court case law on what constitutes something that the government can do to sanction somebody's speech or expression. And I hope Beth will talk a little bit more about some of those specifics of, the truth text doctrine or the fighting words doctrine. But those are some pretty specific sets of parameters that we have to be able to say that somebody's speech can be restricted or punished. Yeah, sure.
We start with, the default is that speech is protected. That's where we begin, and and speech can be stopped or punished or banned only in certain circumstances. And so actually Orion brought up fighting words, and that's a great example. Speech is protected until it becomes fighting words, but fighting words has a really specific definition. Has to be words that are likely to cause a breach of the peace that are aimed at a person in a face-to-face encounter. And so if hate speech, for example, fits within that definition, then it can be punished, but it's punished as fighting words. And we have the notion of true threats. If there's a threat against an individual person that causes them to fear, that's not protected. Or intent to intimidate, which is a very vague and newly created concept. But the idea is that if speech is done with the intent to intimidate a person or a group of people, and that's its sole purpose, it has no other purpose, no political purpose, for example, then it's not protected. And there's others, but those are the ones that tend to come under the umbrella of hate speech mostly. But speech is protected until it moves into one of those other categories.
When it comes as a it was directed towards a specific group, and so to me to look at it as if it wasn't, as if it was looked at as a broader scale is not right. And so if you go back to last year during the election when the Trump wall was made, that was made by a specific club on this campus. And so followed by that was also, I don't know if you guys recall what happened in Charlottesville, but there was also students involved from this campus at that rally, which was also a KKK rally. And so when you have events like this followed up by those two events, that left students, undocumented students, fearing for their lives as well as fearing for the fact that they may be sent somewhere where they're not from. That's something that is directed towards individuals. That's something that's directed towards an entire ethnic group. And that's more than just speech. That is something that in a way could incite or insinuate violence. Something that could start, it's to me at least, it's considered something that could start a fight and especially disturb the peace, because there was people crying at the wall, and they're saying that you don't belong here and that you're not supposed to be here, and handing out flyers saying that report anybody who's undocumented. Now I could pose the question, when have people not of color had to deal with something like that? They don't. And so when you hear that and you see that and you wake up in the morning, you go to class and you're an undocumented student, that's an attack on you. That's an attack on who you are as an individual, who you are as a student. And so they have just as much as a right to be here as anybody else. And to say, to act as if we don't know specifically who did it, but to pretend as if we have no idea, or for the university to pretend as if they have no idea, or they can only do certain actions, to me is not okay. Because when the Black Student Union and students of color have tried to say something, all of a sudden we're swept under the rug. All of a sudden what we have to say is false. All of a sudden we're all fact checked, but when something else happens, they don't know.
Josh, do you have anything to add?
Most of it has been covered by the other three on the panel. These are excellent observations. Just this, obviously the example of the flyers at the library do fall under that potential fighting words. And one of the more landmark cases on this issue, Cohen v. California from 1971, I believe is the majority opinion, kind of put down those standards of it having not protected speech on the grounds of fighting words is something that would have an immediate violent reaction. So something immediate while also, or would also be targeting an individual. So these are things that are not protected speech at all. And these flyers are morally reprehensible. They should never have gone up, and I'm glad that they came down as quickly as they did. And this is an example of, again, and I think Orion did a good job pointing this out, this is the difficulty of having, you know, what the normative, what we ought to be doing as a university and as a student body in terms of, you know, providing the best environment for ourselves while running into these technical protections that these people have when they put up these flyers and these expressions of hate speech. You know, again, like if these flyers came down immediately, then it's up to the people that put them up to like register their complaint and try to make some sort of First Amendment argument. But at that point, it's on them to make their faces, make their voices, make their names known. It's terrible that this keeps happening. You know, the one avenue for moving forward on instances like this, so I'm sure most of you are aware that Richard Spencer and his group of whoever's had an event last week at the University of Florida, and this was after some legal wrangling that universities in states like Texas and Florida have been dealing with as to whether these kinds of events, where these kinds of figures coming to these campuses are creating that immediate violent reaction and are therefore not being protected on a technical level. It wasn't found to be that way in this case, but I think that after the events of Charlottesville, I think after the events of, you know, I hate to say it, even Pullman here last fall, there was something that almost rose to that level, almost having Milo Yiannopoulos coming here in January. This is an evolving conversation, and whether or not the legal system is going to be able to provide a greater level of protection for people who are targeted by these kinds of events remains to be seen. But at this point in time, the best thing that we can do is to provide the services as students, as faculty, as administration for one another to create that environment so that when and if these instances do happen again, that at least we're in the best position to react to them without endangering the students who are being affected by these examples of hate speech.
Do we have further questions? Excellent. Come on up. Oh. All right.
So my question is just, we're talking about freedom of speech, but that's just one of the freedoms of listed in the First Amendment. And I guess I just I'm wondering like why maybe they're all lumped together into one statement, or maybe there's a relationship there, and maybe if anybody who has thoughts on that, like how freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, I think, like there's a whole bunch of them. So I'm just interested in how they're related.
Redress of grievances is the other one. The common thread among all of those is protecting our rights as individual people to have but the beliefs that we want and to be able to articulate and express those beliefs in ways that are appropriate for ourselves. So the right to speak, the right to publish, the right to believe what we want, the right to keep the government from forcing us to believe things that we don't want, the right to demand that the government hear us. Those are all, that's the connection between the five, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of self-governance depends upon those protections being there. And it's not so much that the Constitution gives us those rights. You know, we have those as free people. Those are inherent to being human. And what the Constitution does is prevents and draws a line in the sand and says the government should not be able to impinge upon those natural rights that you already have. And you know, all of those things are kind of related in the idea that we as individuals have those natural rights to believe something different than what the government is telling us. The government does not have the authority over what is true and what is not true, and what is good and what is not good. That remains with the people. And by enshrining those rights all together in the First Amendment, it was a statement by the Founding Fathers of saying, these are some of the most important rights that we have as individuals in a self-governing organization. And so, you know, that's why I think those are in the First Amendment of the first 10 amendments, because that was a statement on their part of saying that these are what we're prioritizing first, because without those rights, you know, the government could come in and force you to say that you believe one thing, or that you are not allowed to criticize the government. Those things give the government so much power over the people that people in positions of power throughout history, when they're given that authority, abuse that authority. And those are the types of situations that you know, we're trying to avoid by instilling that in the Constitution.
Thanks. And I think that the issue of free speech on campus and recent kind of political news on the issue of First Amendment, how the First Amendment is being discussed, shows how important it is for us to understand how all of these elements of the First Amendment are connected to one another. When, you know, if anybody follows politics on Twitter, don't recommend it if you aren't already, you know how discussions about like the role of the media and whether they should be covering the news in a certain way, how we start to see kind of the rules and norms that were supported by the First Amendment kind of being chipped away, at least in word, if not in deed. And other conversations about the Establishment Clause and the Free Expression Clause when it comes to the freedom to practice your religion, as well as free speech, all of these are part of the same conversation, that when we start to see the erosion of standards of how one is held up, these are all co-equal because they're all part of the same amendment. So we need to remember that, you know, even if we don't like to think that, you know, I may not be as religious as the person next to me, but I feel that I hold free speech in a higher regard than the person next to me, it doesn't matter. Like, we're all talking about the same thing, because the panelists are exactly right that once we stop respecting, once we start seeing these elements kind of being taken away piecemeal, that it puts us in a bad position to go forward. And what happens when these norms start being chipped away? Who are the folks that have traditionally been affected? It's been marginalized communities, you know, people of different gender identity, race, sex, sexual orientation, all of that. So again, we want to move forward in a way that we are providing the best environment for everybody going forward, and that shouldn't come at the expense of people who have already been asked to compromise for the last 3-4 centuries.
I think that the First Amendment, when you come to freedom of speech, the government likes to put on this facade that they can't intervene, but if you look at the national anthem protests, that's a version of freedom of speech. However, the moment that you criticize the government, the moment you say anything wrong about the government on a consistent basis, your rights for freedom of speech kind of go out the door. And now they're trying to get you to, they're doing everything they can politically to silence you and to really censor what you have to say. And that can be seen throughout history. Many tend to forget that the Constitution wasn't made for people of color. It was made for everybody else except us. And so when you see that, and it's a consistent thing, now people, just because it's been ratified, just because there have been changes to it, does not mean that it changes to fit us, you know. And so when it comes to the freedom of speech, and the government likes to, again, pretend as if they don't interfere with what we have to say, that's exactly what they do, except they try to go about it in a way that they meddle in things, but say, oh, it wasn't us, it was somebody else.
Do we have any other questions? Come on up. I'll get you next.
So I think a lot of what you have all been talking about has to do with a lot of the kind of political discussions that we've had. Like, we have a president who won't condemn white supremacists, but instead condemns people kneeling for the national anthem. And I mean, there have been a lot of examples that have been talked about. How do we as individuals, how do we as a university, how do we, you know, move forward while trying to both protect marginalized individuals as well as amplify their voices in a way that doesn't lead to arguments about us infringing on the rights of the hate speech to be spoken.
Needs to stop pretending like we're not here and to condemn actions that can be considered hate speech. Now, I understand that hate speech, again, is a concept, and that it's a one that's a fluid concept that changes. However, when there's students of color who don't feel protected by the university, but however, the moment that something happens, like the Trump wall or the video, and they send out an email and that's it, but the moment we say something back, oh, it's protected, oh, it's this, they want to give us facts when we want to come, and take it down or take action, but, we're not really given anything besides the email is not acceptable. And so I think personally the university needs to show that they're not going to accept this, and hitting send, in an email is not going to change anything.
I agree with you. I mean, and the burden of, let me back up. It's always been radicals, and I put that in quotes, people outside the mainstream who've been the ones who've had to bring the First Amendment forward. They're the ones who have helped all of us by creating the situations and the cases that then have the Supreme Court say, yes, that's protected too. And the university has an ethical obligation, absolutely, to condemn. The university has its own speech rights, and it can say, no, we don't like this, no, this is not what we stand for. But the trouble is the university is also a government entity, and it can't punish people for their beliefs. It can't. And so there's that odd balance that the university has to do. It can and it should say that this, these ideas, these hate ideas, aren't what we stand for. But the university can't punish the people unless they're doing fighting words or those other things. The university can't punish the people who are saying them.
This is always the awkward dance as an administrator that you have to do to try to balance those concepts and balance those competing ideals. And they are competing ideals because, many people the vast majority of people at the university, I would say, in my experience, don't want these things to happen. But we're not allowed to do as much as we might want to when they do happen. It sucks because we know that it hurts our students. We know that it causes pain, it causes fear and anxiety, and it causes some of our students to not want to be here. And yet we're also ethically obligated to try to make this a safe and welcoming environment, that people want to be here and they want to engage in and pursue their education. And sometimes those two things are at odds, and sometimes it's impossible, I think, to balance those. And so I don't envy President Schultz when these things happen. I don't envy the people that are charged with being the public face of the university. But at the same time, those are the people that are the public face of the university that have to make these decisions, and that's a tough spot to be in. When we're talking about these concepts of defining hate speech, that is kind of a nebulous topic, and the courts have not done their job in adequately defining it in a way that protects people. The most vulnerable people in our society are not protected adequately by the protections that the court talks about, in my opinion. But the struggle with that is a lot of times what it comes down to is who's going to decide what is okay and what is not okay. Because, if you put your trust in me to be able to decide that this is going to be something that we stop and this is going to be something that we allow, and you are okay with me because you understand, you know me and you trust me, what happens when I'm gone and the next person comes in that is not, aligning with your values and your beliefs? What happens when there's a change in administration, that somebody comes in that is not acting within the norms of our political system and is not acting in the best interest of everyone? What happens then? And when we've seen these things in the past, there have been hate speech codes at college campuses in the past. And there are many instances of when colleges tried to implement those policies, they more often than not were implemented against the minority groups that they were intended to protect in the beginning. And those are the things that I worry about when we're talking about making those kinds of distinctions. And so I don't want to see policies change in a way that is going to end up hurting the marginalized communities here. And I'm always going to be advocating for protecting our students and making sure that they have a safe environment. But again, sometimes there's these competing concerns that it's just not okay, and it's not. I'm not able to, you know, these are bigger questions than I can answer. I mean, these are societal issues that, you know, everyone has to deal with. These are issues that are going to affect us throughout our lives, and, you know, I don't always know what the answer is.
It sucks because the people who have been targeted by these kinds of actions are in a lose-lose situation at this point in time, it seems like. Either you let these events like the Trump wall or whatever go forward, and then all of a sudden the people who are part of these groups feel like they're being targeted, justifiably feeling that way. On the other hand, if these kinds of events are prohibited by the university, then those people that wanted to put up the Trump wall or have Milo on campus have grounds to sue the campus, and then all of a sudden they have a moral, heavy air quotes here, moral victory on the matter, and then we get back to square one without anybody being helped out of it that needs to be helped. I've had some issues with the way that the administration has responded to some of these incidents in the past, especially after Charlottesville, but at the same time, I understand the difficult dance that they have to partake in. But what has heartened me about these things that have happened over the last year, especially last October during the Trump Hall event, I got to see many factors over people opposing these kinds of expressions as opposed to those that were, you know, shouting down people of color. Those people that were shouting down people of color are in the minority, and they should not be doing that, but what we can and we should be doing is going forward, even if we don't have the technical avenues to prohibit this kind of stuff, then to look towards our student leaders to encourage their colleagues, assure their colleagues and their constituents that they're being helped, they're being protected, they're being respected, and finding avenues that can counteract these kinds of actions in the future, even if the law is not there to help these groups.
Okay. Anybody else? A quick question? Okay, I'm going to ask you to kind of keep it a little bit short, and I'm going to ask the panelists to be very brief so we have time for everyone to have their final remarks. Okay, come on. Thank you.
Hi. This panel and discussion has mainly been about the value of free speech, but all I've heard so far was that it's based on racial perspective, and the one thing that takes away freedom of speech is hate speech. I mean, it thwarts it, it diminishes it in every way, and that targets European Americans, mostly white people. So, to play the devil advocate here, to have a broader sense of what hate speech means to each one of the panel members. Thank you.
And let's see, we have about 10 minutes, so why don't you all kind of, maybe we'll just kind of let this fold into your conclusion. So we'll take up the last 10 minutes with this, because I think we might get an interesting discussion here. We'll see how it goes. Panel.
First one to kind of get this out of the way. As somebody else of the Caucasian persuasion, I have not personally, or anybody in my group of friends has experienced the same level of insecurity from actions of hate speech or hate actions as my colleagues that happen to be people of color. That's what paints my perspective on this issue, as well as the research that I've done over the last 5 years in political science. Everything that I've seen has only supported the idea that when these kinds of rights revolving around the First Amendment are affected in any way, the first people that are being affected most deleteriously, most negatively, are people of color. So, you know, while there may be something of a movement to say that, you know, actually it's the reverse trend is true, it's oftentimes people that are using the perspective that they have of their immediate groups around them and looking at a kind of small n, a small sample size to kind of inform that view. I'm not saying that I want to deny the truth of anybody's experiences, but from my perspective and from my experiences, both as a professional and as a student leader, the way in which these events have happened, both on campus and beyond over the last year, need to be tackled in the way that this panel has discussed over the last hour.
Man, I think, for people that have experienced privilege their entire lives, it's, trying to put yourself in that perspective of, I've never experienced oppression, so equality and diversity efforts, I think for those people can sometimes feel like oppression, but that's not what oppression is. When people are subjected to kind of the draining, the exhausting, day-to-day cumulative effect of the kind of systemic problems that we have that center around race, I think that's some of what a lot of people are struggling with trying to understand when they don't have that experience. And that is oppression that lasts through generation after generation after generation. That's not something that we can fix in a panel discussion. It's not something that our country has been able to fix. It might not be something that we can ever fix, but it's always what we should strive for, eliminating, reducing, getting rid of as much as we can. Human beings, our brains are hardwired to try to classify people into different groups and different boxes. It's the way that our brain chemistry has evolved, where when we were hunter-gatherers, we were out there in the wild looking to determine whether somebody was friend or foe, whether something was prey, or whether something was going to eat us. And so our brains have developed a very kind of quick way to put people into boxes, put different situations into boxes, and do that very quickly, but not very accurately. And so as we've evolved and as our society has evolved into kind of complex organizational structures, complex languages, and complex ways and different perspectives that we view and interact with the world, we're still hardwired to put people in boxes, even though all of those other things make it much more complex than being able to do that in an easy and quick way. And that's kind of underlying all of these issues of, taking a step back and getting above our brain's simple mechanism, because we do have intelligence and we do have free will and we do have the ability to analyze and critically think about these situations. And what we should be doing is taking a step back and trying to make, rise above that and recognize that race in general is a social construct, and it's not a biological. It is not a biological construct. Sure, but the fact is that race is a social construct. Genetically, there is very, very, very little difference, to the point where it doesn't make a difference when we talk about it biologically. Sure.
Well, on that note, to answer your question, no, I do not consider myself white. I am an African American man. And speaking on the topic of racism and hate speech and all of that, this country was built on oppression, and it thrives on oppression. And even to this day, we are still oppressed as people of color. And, a lot of people in this room may not know what oppression feels like, but oppression is something where you feel like you can't walk out your door and you're scared. So you're scared to wake up, you're scared to go to sleep, you're scared to cross the road. It's the fact that I have to look in the mirror as when I was younger, and wonder why I'm not seen as equal. And to have, not only just me, but my siblings, and I fear for, the women in my life, both, especially my family, especially my mom, because black women are treated worse than anybody else in this country. And yet the country, the president, America does nothing about it. They like to say, well, we changed the 3/5 compromise, we ended slavery. What does that do? Because at the end of the day, we're still seen as somebody who's not equal. we're still seen as somebody, we still have to fight for our rights. It's ridiculous that we have to go sit somewhere to be heard, but, you know, somebody can tweet something and the president can tweet right back, you know, but we have to knock on his door multiple times, you know, and so he can make all the excuses he wants. The university can make all the excuses they want, and so can this country. But what they cannot deny is that their past, their history, and even the present is still based off of racism. And to say colorblindness is a thing, you know, you can be colorblind, but that does not make you racist. That doesn't not make you racist. And you have to accept the fact that there is such thing as privilege, and a lot of people choose to not accept that. A lot of people choose to look past it. That's not true neither. Privilege is real, but privilege is also real for those who have never experienced oppression. Now, I read history.
Thank you, Ryan, for mentioning women as well. And I certainly, women are also the topic of hate speech. We get it as well, although clearly women of color get the double whammy. You asked what the definition of hate speech was, and Dan is right. There's no legal definition, but the definition I give in my classes when I teach First Amendment is hate speech is slurs and epithets and so on that are aimed at somebody because of unchangeable characteristics that they have, and that are part of a historical or social context of prejudice. And so for the example I use in my class is, you know, I'm blonde. People tease me about being blonde sometimes, but that's not hate speech. I'm a female. When people take issue with me being female, that is hate speech. That's the definition I operationalize in my class. When I was thinking about how I would end this, I was assuming we would talk a bit about the university and its response and how it can respond to hate speech and other types of speech that really, really hurts people. And I came up with 5 C words, and I don't ever do this. This is like, it just came to me. The university can condemn that speech. The university has the right and the obligation, the ethical obligation to condemn it. The university can challenge it. Challenge that through dialogue, through discussion, through whatever means are necessary. The university can critique it. That's the 3rd C I came up with. University definitely can critique that language that comes and the reactions that come from it. And the university can engage in conversation about it as well. But the last one, the university cannot censor it. But the university can condemn, challenge, critique, and converse.
We're going to go ahead and finish this, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming and being part of something that's a really important conversation that we're having as a university, as a country, and really pretty much internationally as well. As a librarian, I have to comment and say that if you're interested in any of the issues that have come up in this debate, I encourage you to actually use the libraries to follow up on some of the issues and do a little bit of research so that we can all be more informed. Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye. Great. An extra hand for the panelists, please.